leveraging employee listening to foster equity, inclusion, and belonging. So a little bit about our moderator, Juliana Tafur. She is the CEO of Listen Courageously, which is an award-winning filmmaker of Listen, board member for the International Listening Association, and former Discovery Network's content executive. Juliana is convinced that listening to stories has the ability to change us. She'll tell you that she's been on the listening journey since producing Listen, which brings together people on opposite ends of the spectrum to connect to a human level and transcend their differences. And as mentioned, if you visit the Listen Courageously booth, you'll get a preview of that award-winning documentary. So Juliana is going to lead us today. We have amazing speakers with Fossil Group, BAE Systems, and the National Basketball Association. So I don't want to take up any more time. I'm going to hand the mic over to you, Juliana, and hear more from these amazing speakers.
Thank you so much for that, Charlene. And I think I'll just pass it over to them very quickly after that amazing introduction so that they can introduce themselves, and then we'll get started. So I'll start off with Ruchi. Jalla, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Ruchi Jalla. I'm the Vice President and Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at BAE Systems, Inc.
Perfect. Thank you, Ruchi. Oris Stuart, please. Welcome.
Welcome, and thank you. Thank you for letting me join you. I'm Oris Stuart, Chief People and Inclusion Officer at the National Basketball Association. Good to be here with you today.
Thank you so much, Oris. And Sheri Crosby Willer. Hello, Sheri.
Hi, everybody. I'm glad to be here with you today. I'm Sheri Crosby Wheeler, and I am the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at Fossil Group. Yes, the watches.
Well, yes, we have an amazing group of panelists here today, and I am so honored to join them. And to get started, why don't we take a few minutes for a brief exercise? I know we asked you all previously to bring paper and scissors, but if you're doing this at home, or if you don't have a set of scissors handy, it's okay. You can also just tear the paper with your hands. And what we want to do here is we want to invite you to think about listening, since this panel is about leveraging employee listening to foster equity, inclusion, and belonging. So we've been listening all of our lives, and oftentimes we don't think that we need to learn to listen differently. So with this quick exercise, I'm interested to hear from our panelists what comes up for them after we go through it. So it's simple. You just have to follow a few directions. But there are several conditions. One, you're not allowed to ask me any questions. And two, you're not allowed to non-verbally get me to confirm or deny anything. Okay? So the three directions, they're simple. First, take your piece of paper, put it in front of you, fold it in half, and either tear off or cut off the bottom left-hand corner. I'll repeat that again. You don't have to do it again. I'll just repeat it again in case you didn't catch it. So take your piece of paper, fold it in half, and either tear off or cut off the bottom left-hand corner. Okay. Okay, then we fold the paper in half again. Tear off the upper right-hand corner. So I'll repeat that again. Fold the paper in half again and tear off the upper right-hand corner. Okay, and then the final direction, fold the paper in half once more and tear off the upper left-hand corner. So fold the paper in half again and tear off the upper left-hand corner. Okay. So when you're done, go ahead and open it up and show it to everyone. Let us see your designs. What did you come up with? Okay. Can you, ooh, this is interesting. Lovely. So we all have different designs, as you can see. So if listening were easy, wouldn't we all have the same end result? right? That's the point here. So clearly, we all hear things differently, and especially when not allowed to ask questions. So one of the conditions at the top was that you couldn't ask me any questions. And it is often in the kind of small things that we don't have a shared meaning on. So maybe if someone would have asked, is it horizontal or is it vertical? Maybe you probably would have ended in a much similar spot. But in the absence of feedback or two-way communication, there's simply a lot that can go wrong, right? So I want to just open it up and see if you have any particular thought on that, or if not, we'll just get started with the rest of the questions that I have prepared for you today.
I wanted to say something really quickly. As I was thinking through it, I was like, oh, we're making a snowflake. But the way that you explain it, it makes me think about the different interpretations of what we hear. And how that's such a simple exercise. I might steal it, but how we interpret things differently, especially if we can't get clarification, if we make assumptions, if we don't have feedback. So it was really effective.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I thought it was incredibly effective. I mean, it's so simple, but it's as powerful as it is simple. And what I think is quite fascinating is it really is about where you start, right? So the first fold, the first cut sets the pace for everything else. So even if we got the same instructions and had a chance to ask you clarifying questions, the fact that we would have started in different places means that we're going to end up in different places. So how you start a conversation or a process is incredibly important. I really enjoyed the exercise.
Thank you, Oris.
I just want to add, I'm temporarily in a sling right now, so I was making adjustments based on what was physically possible for me. So that just sort of added another dimension as well in terms of what was easiest to be the top left or bottom left.
Wow. Yeah. So I don't know if you all noticed, but a few things came up, like where you start also applies a lot to the work that we all do in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and making adjustments based on where we are or what our needs are. So, okay, let's start off with the power of sharing stories, really, because I think a lot of us have had to do a lot of deep listening, especially this past year. And I know that individually, each of you as heads of diversity, equity, and inclusion have had to invite your people into either gatherings or courageous conversations or town halls, whatever you've chosen to call it. I would love if you could walk us briefly through programs that you have offered where you stimulate both employee listening and sharing. So who would like to take that first? Maybe I'll start off with Sheri, since she was last.
I knew it. I knew it was going to be. Like you said, I think there are a lot of organizations that are creating that space for employees. A lot have done it before last summer, but even more have done it. And I'll just, because I don't want to talk too long or take up my colleagues' time, but one thing that I'll point out about creating those spaces is having really good facilitation and having the person who's facilitating be one of the first people to share, to kind of get things started, to open up that space, because I think a lot of employees are just hesitant. We haven't had it be where workplaces you could come and you could authentically share something that people think is outside of the workplace when we know it's not. So I think that's one of the really important points for these conversation spaces that have been increasingly created in corporations.
Wonderful. Yeah. So I know when we talked earlier, Ruchi, you mentioned a very comprehensive program that you have launched internally. And I'd love you to share a little bit of what that has entailed for you as a company.
Sure. So, just on the theme of listening, our courageous conversations have sort of a couple of components to it, starting with a senior leader panel who have already gone through days of sessions to improve their listening. So they're sort of coming into it as alumni of the program, having honed those skills already. So we asked them to be vulnerable, and we asked them to share, things that they've learned through the sessions, just to start that conversation, right? Just to open it up. And then we have an employee panel of storytellers that will share their reactions in terms of experiences that they've had in the workplace. And then we join those two panels together to give each other feedback. So this is all in the context of other employees also listening. It's almost operating like a virtual fishbowl, where these two panels are talking to each other saying, wow, I've never heard a leader talk about like things like that in the organization. And for employees to get feedback thinking, I didn't know this was happening to you. This is so different from my experience. And other employees are able to listen. And then when we open it up, they can either share their own story or ask questions. Mm-hmm. And it's been one of those instances where we get a lot more out from the employees that are listening, because then we're also hearing from them what's on their mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this kind of connects to what Sheri was saying about creating those spaces for people to bring their whole selves to work, really, sometimes for the first time. We're not used to sharing that kind of vulnerability about the things that have impacted us. So I'm curious to hear in a little bit also how that affects kind of the teamwork and camaraderie that develops probably naturally, right? But I'll go to Oris. I'd love to hear what are some of the things that you have implemented at the NBA that have been successful and stimulated employee listening and sharing.
We've built quite a bit of infrastructure on this topic, and our first example of this really goes back to 2016, the day after the election. We all came back to the office, and there was a divided country, there's a divided organization. And so we hastily called a community conversation together, where we followed some of the same strategy or protocol that you just heard, but it became a process for us to convene our employees after all other types of momentous occasions or tragic occasions, and so on. And so over the course of the last 5 years, we've had a dozen of those, some after particular events, others just because we wanted to keep talking and keep communicating, and in turn build more of a capacity to understand each other and to hear from each other. The structure is very similar, opened with a brief panel discussion and the breakout groups, facilitated conversations where we capture the input from the group, capture the wisdom of the crowd, if you will, and then we publish that for the whole organization. The only thing I would say is, one of the challenges of having these listening sessions is that you've got to then respond, right? I mean, it's one thing to capture the information, but then you build up an expectation that you're going to, do something about it, or at least be responsive in some way. So I'd also add that in addition to the enterprise level listening, we also built out more individualized conversations. And so we have listening sessions with focus groups based on different cohorts. And then I personally and others on my team reach out one-on-one with select individuals. So we're trying to do it at a lot of different tiers and levels.
Oh, that's fascinating. And
Juliana, can I jump in real quick?
Absolutely, Sheri.
That what Oris talks about, those different ways that you can do it, I think that's really critically important, to have different channels and different groups of employees come together, from one-on-one, which can be super impactful, although you're not reaching everyone, to the large enterprise group gatherings. And so I try to employ all of those methods. And I think sometimes even the one-on-one, it feels like, oh, I'm only talking to one person, but the impact when that person takes that knowledge back to their team, it still has ripple effects, even though you're only talking to one person. Mm-hmm. And so all of those different avenues are important.
Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out. And I guess that segues perfectly into what have been some of the main takeaways or lessons learned from these sessions, and specifically, how listening has impacted people in the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Who would like to start that?
I can start, and I just wanted to pick up on another thing Oris said, which was back in 2016. When we had the Pulse nightclub shooting happen in June, And we had a lot of people sort of rally around. This was our employee resource groups trying to get together, talking to their employees and saying, how do we want to respond? And then just a month or two later, Philando Castile and Alton Sterling back to back. And our Black and African American employee resource group wasn't asking for the same level of response. And when we talked, I said, why? And they said, we didn't know we were allowed to have these conversations at work. So since then, I wouldn't say that we were equipped then. I think since then, we've been working really hard on not only creating that space for listening, but sharing as well. So I think the impact of what we're seeing is more sharing and more listening, more than we ever really thought we could do before, because it didn't really feel like that was the topic that we could really talk about at work, right? There's the taboo topics that just weren't discussed. And as much as we've been seeing employees willing to share their story, that's opening more employees up to say, wow, does that mean that there's a space for me to share too? So, and just for colleagues to get to know each other, right? That these are not abstract issues. These are happening to people that we work with side by side, or even in the virtual sense, you know, and with the one box over on a Zoom call. So it personalizes it in the extent that, you know, we can remove all the political conversations about it. This is this person that I know that I work with that is going through this at this moment in this workplace, and I need to be able to respond to them. That I've seen that level of allyship and advocacy come through.
And that is just, I praise all of you for having the courage to step up and have those conversations and respond to what is happening in the world that affects us all. Because the workplace is such a place. It's a place where, you know, we can all lean into our colleagues to be better together. We're not just entities that operate in a world that is separate from who we are as people and what we bring into the workplace. But it's not easy, you know, like you said, dealing with those taboo topics, and are we allowed to do it? So, I mean, I know there was the other kind of unanswered question, but this kind of trickled in. So maybe we can talk both about takeaways as well as like, why, right? Why have you taken this on? Like, why is it, you know, part of your mission, and how does it contribute really to the work that you do? Because I know that you've taken the lead, but many others probably haven't, or haven't embraced it as much because they are still fearful.
Yeah, I'll jump in here and just say that the reason we've taken this on, and one of the things we've learned, is that our employees expect it and need it, right? I mean, we all show up to work with whatever we woke up with on our minds, on our shoulders, in our hearts. And increasingly, my experience is that employees are expecting their employers to create space for these conversations. I mean, there's so much less confidence in the political structures and the community structures, and they're putting a lot of reliance on their employers to create the space and the capacity to have these conversations. And if you don't have them, they're going to happen anyway, right? They're going to happen amongst colleagues. They're going to happen in people's heads, and it's going to be something that gets in the way of being effective in productivity. And by having them, we get to build, I think, a deeper level of intimacy with each other, a higher level of trust. It doesn't mean we're all going to be aligned, but at least we have a deeper sense of where folks are, and then we can, respond accordingly. And so I would just say, and I said earlier, one of the other things you learn is when you have these conversations, you don't have to respond to everything, but you do have to have a point of view on some things, and have to show folks that, okay, we heard you, and then here's what we're going to do about it.
Yeah. Would you like to hop on, Sheri?
Yeah, I think one of the takeaways that I've seen from having these types of conversations is when they start, it probably is like a continuum. So if you're an organization and you're new to it and you're just starting, you might find that employees, because it hadn't happened before, are reluctant to share. And so they're kind of quiet, and there's some probing and some prodding, and come on, no, it's okay. And then as you have more of them, and as you move down the path and show we are creating this space, there's not going to be some crazy repercussion, then you have more employees that are willing to share. I think also what happens too is, especially when it comes around a tragedy, which it's unfortunate, and I try to mix them up. So we created, we call them group gatherings, because I think I told you, Juliana, I don't like to use the word courageous because I don't want to build it up in people's head that it's going to be hard because you have to have courage. So I try to call it anything but that. But I understand it does still take courage. But I try to mix them up so that there's the times to come together when we need that space for something that has happened, but also just a time to come together for learning. And all of them fall under that umbrella. So it's like, oh, this one will be, we need it to share. And this one will be, we're coming together to learn. So for instance, next week we'll have one, a fossil group gathering about Juneteenth. And we're gonna just learn and we're gonna talk and we're gonna share. So they know that that space is there and it has 2 points. I don't always want it to be a space where it's like, something super awful has happened, let's go talk about it. I mean, and it's good to have that, but I don't want them to think that's the only time that we'll come together to discuss. But I think there's just a continuum that happens, and I want people to understand it. It shouldn't always be on the person or the community that's been affected to be the one speaking into that space, because it's already hard. You're already experiencing it. And so you get to a point where allies understand, I have to come in and do some of this emotional labor too. I need to take some of that off of my colleagues' shoulders and let them know that I'm listening, that I care, that I'm trying to be empathetic. So
I'd love to hear if you can kind of think back on all of your listening sessions, gatherings. Is there a particular anecdote that you'd like to share of, you know, a session that you carried out that had really positive impacts that made you go, this works, you know, I want to keep pushing through? And this goes for all of you. Like, was there like a, you know, coming together, kind of opening of hearts, or, you know, I really deeply connect, or I really want to work harder for you, for the society to be more equitable for all of us? Like, have there been moments like that that have kind of reaffirmed the value that this has?
Yeah, I could definitely speak to something that happened this past summer in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the global movement for social justice. I know we all had lots of conversations. We're all dealing with lots of emotions, and hopefully for most of us, policy and practice, you know, efforts and commitments. But at our organization, it was clear that there was so much energy from our individual employees to do something. I mean, quite frankly, the listening sessions ran their course, and the feedback we heard is we want to act. We want the company to help create space and a platform for us to actually get our hands in the mix, you know, to do something and expend some energy for the good. And so many of our departments, I'd say most of our departments, created their own social justice task forces. And then those task forces have been, you know, in some respect, unleashed on a host of different programs and strategies and commitments, some for the good of the organization, but mostly for the good of the broader community. And I would just say that's an outcome of conversations and listening sessions that then turned into really action, and they persist, and they're meeting twice a month, and you know, finding capacity to get, you know, things done that we would have never contemplated before. And so it's been a real incredible contribution to the organization.
Wow, thank you for sharing that great experience. How about for you, Ruchi?
Yeah, so we have a similar story. After our town hall for the Black African American ERG that hosted the town hall, they were planning on hosting it in June to talk about the impacts of COVID. And in that time, George Floyd's murder happened. And so they shifted focus. And so that ended up being a healing session. We actually asked people, some leaders who wanted to attend, we asked them not to, and said, this is for the ERG, let them have their space and heal. And then that really turned into resolve. What are we going to do about it? So they had an idea generation session. There were hundreds of ideas that came out. They were in, virtual breakout rooms and saying, what do we need to do? We brought all of those ideas into some key themes and worked with the teams and said, okay, does this sort of represent what you're looking for? And we came down to 7 themes that we then created vision teams around. And our whole effort was called CARE, which is Colleagues Advancing Racial Equity. And those teams were made up of 130 plus people from throughout the organization that were working on these key themes. Things like increasing the racial diversity of our leadership development efforts, or increasing mental health and well-being resources, or finding a different way to attract the next generation of talent. So there were different themes around that people coalesced around. They presented their ideas to the senior leadership team. And this was a different way of doing things, right? If there was an opportunity before, it would come to the DEI team and they would say, what should we do? And we'd give them a list of recommendations. We took our time. The recommendations may have started in June, but weren't presented until the end of October, because we wanted to make sure we got a wide array of input and that it didn't feel like we were going off and deciding what these actions were going to be without this input. So we wanted it to be, employee driven, but company supported, so that we then take the ownership of what needs to change that isn't on the ERG itself. But through those conversations, they also had their own sessions of listening as they were starting to team build and work on these ideas. And one instance where a man spoke about, he had gone through an adoption process where he had adopted his Black son, and he's white, his whole family is. And he just was baffled by the response that he got from his family members, people that he wouldn't have expected, turning away or making comments that were completely insensitive. And it was just a different experience, again, of seeing this man on the screen, brought to tears on some of what he was sharing, and all of his colleagues then reaching out and saying, I see you. And it was just, it's something that I wouldn't have even expected could have happened in a virtual setting, but just that outpouring of support and gratitude for sharing that, and other people then sharing similar stories. It was just amazing that they were able to share, learn, listen, and then grow from there, right? Because that was part of their growing process, to then work together and say, how are we all in this together? And like I said, they then brought their recommendations forward and said, here's what I see as our path.
Yeah. So I do want to leave some time for Q&A at the end. I do see some questions coming. Before that, though, my kind of toughest question of the day would be, this is all beautiful, wonderful, fascinating, so deeply important, transformative, really. How are we reaching people who might not want to engage, who might not want to listen? So I want to focus on your individual strategies. What has worked for you? And I think I'll start with Sheri, because she hasn't spoken in a little bit.
I think the way that I do it is to continually reinforce the message that any space that's created is for everyone. Also, especially if it's a one-on-one situation that I have, I let people know we can talk about anything, and I'm not going to stand in judgment of them. So I had a pretty tough conversation last summer after we had listening sessions, et cetera, and an employee was like, I'm not about this, and I don't believe in Black Lives Matter, and this is wrong. And I said, let's talk about it. I invited her. I said, let's talk about it. And I think she expected for me to come at her in a different way, or for me to tell her she was wrong, or for me to try to shut her down. And I think just in that session, she understood. It's like, we don't necessarily have to agree to listen to each other, to hear what each other is saying, and to try to just say, okay, well, why do you think that? And try to get into their mind. That doesn't mean I agree with her, but I listened to her. And I don't think she expected that. I think she expected for her viewpoint to be automatically shut down. And so that really moved. Even if it was one person, I think, okay, she went back to her team. She was like, hey, those are folks over there in DNI, they'll listen to you, even if you don't have an opinion that's quote unquote popular. And I was like, yeah, take it back into the organization. So that's how I try to work on getting people to come along, people who are reticent. I also tell them that when you share, that is a gift to, like feedback is a gift, sharing is a gift to the rest of the employees. And that is how we learn and grow, most importantly, is from hearing from the individual experiences that each of us have. So when you do that, you are helping so many people. And I tell them that too. So that's what I do.
Thank you. That was a great story. I just was wondering here, did she also begin to listen to you after you listened to her? Because that's usually what ensues.
I think so.
Yeah, great. I'll go to Oris.
So what a great example. I would say two things. I should say two reasons why people might not be inclined to participate in the process, right? One is just their very nature, personality. They're introverted. They've got quiet voices. It doesn't mean they're not thinking deeply about these things, but they may not be as prepared or open to sharing. And then I think there's another group that just is asking themselves, for what? For who, for what, right? I mean, my voice isn't going to matter. They're not going to take action. So why should I bother? Why should I expend the energy? And so I think that's really why it's so important. Number one, to have different modalities, different approaches to meet people where they are. And so for some, that group setting is going to give them energy. They're going to be expressive and they're going to contribute in a dynamic way. For others, you got to get them in a one-on-one situation. And for everyone, you've got to give them a sense that you really are hearing. You got to play back what you heard, and you got to take some steps through action, through communications, whatever, just to say, hey, we're trying to be responsive. And you can't always do everything that folks want you to do. But again, I just think it really is. And how do you get there? You get you get people at lots of different levels. And we had a group, we invited everyone in this particular demographic to participate. We got about 65, 70% buy-in. And then I just started picking up the phone. My colleagues started picking up the phone for the folks that didn't sign up and, said, hey, let's talk. And one last thing, all of us have infrastructure for this, and that is the people managers. Now, everyone's not equipped to take these conversations, some of them particularly sensitive, into their teams. But we have built out toolkits and built out an expectation that as a people person, as a leader, as a manager of people, you're going to have the competency to facilitate these conversations in your team meetings, because that's where you have everyone's attention. So I also think that's an important way to capture those folks that might be reticent to engage otherwise.
Wonderful. Yeah. And then I know you also mentioned earlier the action you're taking. So those who are showing up and saying why maybe are, perhaps saying that there have been things implemented. So the why hopefully has been answered. Ruchi, I'll go to you now.
Yeah, it's hard to build on such great answers because it's very comprehensive in terms of the things we should be doing and the things we are doing. What I would add is just ways that we're trying to facilitate some of the one-on-one conversation. So we've started a program called Bridge, which is a cross-cultural reciprocal mentoring program. And it's in the sense where no one is the mentee. There's a mentor one and a mentor two. And they are asked to share their experiences in a safe environment. And so they don't even get matched until maybe 2 or 3 months in the process. So, where traditional mentoring programs may give someone a launch of here's, how to be a mentor, or here's how to have your development plan ready for your mentor. We sort of take them through a couple of steps of trust building before they even get joined up. And then we talk to them about, how, where does your identity come from, right? What is your cultural identity? How do you share that? How do you identify, and then how can you share that with others or your mentor? And that facilitates this open session for them to have this conversation. And that gives them practice, right? Practice makes progress. And they're able to then do that with their mentor, and then able to do that with their team members as well, right? So we're trying to select from individuals who sometimes have large teams, right? And that they can facilitate these conversations and skills and then use them with others as well. Because that's really what we want to be doing at the end of the day. It's not just this one conversation, but having that sort of ripple effect.
Yeah, so much goodness here. A lot of nuggets of information for, the audience watching to hopefully, take some ideas of things that they can also incorporate within their workplaces. So I'm going to go to audience questions to give people a chance to interact with us. And there's a question for Ruchi and a question for Oris right now, and I'm sure something will come up for Sheri as well. I'm going to start with Oris because Ruchi just spoke. So the question says, Oris mentioned that their listening sessions ran their course. Do you have advice or best practices that would encourage listening sessions to continue every day in different ways without a formal gathering or initiative?
I do, and what that question really speaks to is building a culture of two-way communication in the organization. By the way, one of the benefits of building that out is creating more of a spirit of innovation across the organization, because people are sharing not only about topics that are sensitive or timely, but also just about the business. And so how do you do that, or how are we trying to do it? Well, one of the strategies we've taken, and I mentioned this a bit earlier, is as a manager, as a leader, one of the competencies you're evaluated on, and that your team evaluates you on from feedback mechanism we have, is, are you a good listener? Do you facilitate or create an environment where people can speak freely and can contribute? And we actually are very focused on having inclusive conversation, inclusive meetings, where we actually suggest that you do things to make sure introverts are contributing at the same level that others might be. And so I guess the simple thread here is holding your managers accountable for creating an environment where folks are engaged every day, and building that into the way you do business. That's what we're at least attempting as we put more emphasis on leadership competencies, with one of them being two-way communication.
Thank you for that. The other question, though, this was the one that was for Ruchi, says, Ruchi mentioned a session where she asked some leaders not to attend a session to allow healing. How was that received as we push for inclusion? What was the reaction of the leaders?
So there was some confusion. The town hall was happening, it was already scheduled, and I'd received some feedback or questions whether the most senior leaders were going to attend. And it wasn't just a question, it was, if they attend, what's going to be the reaction or space for people to share openly. And so we had to take a step back and see what was the purpose of the session in the first place. And if the purpose was to be able to have a healing session where people could speak freely, would that be hindered by certain people attending the session? And so I had a very frank conversation with the senior leadership team, and I said, this is not for you. And if you haven't been a member of this ERG before, which they could have joined, right? That we ask that you don't attend. We're not going to monitor it. We're not going to kick you off if we see you there. But all I'm asking is, if you haven't been here before, the question is going to be, why are you here now? So I just leave that with you and say, this session, they want to be able to have a conversation amongst the family, right? And that means people that look like them and people that have been allies with them all the way up to this point. And And when they're ready to have you at that conversation, I'll let you know.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the most honest I could be, just to make sure that we were representing the session the way that our employees needed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Sheri, I see you desperately wanting to jump in.
Because I wanted to speak on that really quickly, and I think that's very interesting and very courageous. The word I don't like to use. Say, hey, no, senior leaders, you sit over there. We did it as well, and you know what we did? The senior leaders could come, CEO on down, but we muzzled them. And boy, they wanted to get in there. They were behind the scenes. Can we talk? Because they want to fix it. Like, we're going to do that. And we're like, that's not what this is for. This is not an action planning session. This is just for people to a release valve. That's the way I looked at it. An ability to just let it out, and we just let it sit. And so the leaders were on there, and for them to have to sit and not talk, because they're used to talking, taking out, coming up, I'm going to fix it, and taking the air out of the room. And for them to sit there, sit on their hands, I know it was tough, but you could tell that they had to just listen, and it was impacting them. Some of them you could see on the screen, they started to cry. I was like, oh my word, but they were not talking. We didn't allow them to come in and say, this is what the company's going to do, or anything like that. So that's another way to go about it. Say, hey, you can't be here, or hey, you got to be quiet. And just let the employees have their space.
Yeah. Just want to kind of uplift how much sensitivity this work requires, and kind of knowing what you need to meet your people, and how you need to balance, everyone who's interacting in this, senior leadership, and as well as employees. Okay, so I think a question that can wrap us up is also coming from the audience. How do you think D&I leaders can continue listening efforts well beyond 2021? I think it's a great one. And maybe I'll start off with Oris.
These issues and challenges in the environment that we're going to be coming out of from a pandemic standpoint, but whatever the case, these issues are going to persist. And so we have the opportunity to continue to dialogue and continue to provide updates and continue to work together on these issues. But what I really think has happened, certainly for us, is we've built a capacity now to have frank, candid, open conversations about anything. And one of our guiding principles when we open these conversations is assume positive intent. Don't make judgments. And so what I think it has done is fostered an environment where we can actually use some of these conversations about core business issues and create a culture of sharing and communication and contribution that's at a level that's different than where we were before this. So it's almost, take the dividend of this very challenging environment and spend some of it on advancing the interests of the business, and because that's why we're here, right? And I think if we do that, and the conversation dynamic transcends just these very sensitive issues, well, then it just becomes how we show up every day and how we engage as colleagues. And so that's our ambition. We're certainly not there yet, but I think that's what we're shooting for.
Great. How about for you, Ruchi?
So I would say, sort of two things, and what Oris and Sheri have shared. One is that we don't want to be opportunistic. We want to be able to continue these conversations, and not just when there's some sort of tragedy happening, right? So just keep that muscle going. We do have an inclusive leader goal that we've introduced this year. We've had sort of iterations of this before, but it does require our people managers to have these dialogues ongoing. We have a set of tools for them to use and videos that can prompt conversation. And then we have launched programs this year that help more leaders have conversations. So we recognize sometimes that it's really hard to get in. So one toolkit that we created, for example, was with conversation starters and what to say if you're stuck, right? And how you listen just to listen and not to respond. So you can acknowledge, affirm someone's experience without having to say, okay, what am I going to do to fix that?
Or I agree with you.
Mm-hmm.
People don't understand, you can say, I see you, I understand what you've gone through, I can connect and feel it. I still disagree, but we can connect at a human level, right? So I'll pass it over to Sheri to wrap us up.
For real?
Yeah, just the
Well,
final thought.
I don't think I have anything to add to my, esteemed panelists, what they've shared. I think that what they've shared is right on point. So I'll just in there. I also see something in the chat saying time. So I'm like, I'm not going over our time. I'm gonna give it back to you, Juliana. But thank you.
Thank you. This has been wonderful, inspiring, informative. Thank you all so much for the work that you're doing in your respective workplaces, for sharing it with me, with the audience, and I'll pass it over to Charlene.